There might be the periodic cat. Hey. Don't beat each other up.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Happy Halloween! This is Eric Isaacson, Senior UX Engineer at 3 Pillar Global, and you are listening to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 16. Our guest today is Evan Light. Evan is a software developer. He has nearly 20 years of professional experience, and he has a passion for community service in general. And Evan spent several years as a volunteer EMT, and he more recently founded and has continued to run the Ruby DCamp unconference, in quotes, since 2008. And he is a respected member of the Ruby community, having spoken at several Ruby-related conferences over the years. That's how I got to meet Evan. Evan was at Ruby Nation this year, talking about remote pair programming and telling us all the ins and outs of that, and a really, really great guy to talk with about anything. Very, very cool guy. So, Evan, I'll pass it over to you. For those uninitiated and don't know anything about pair programming, can you please tell our listeners what you're talking about? What is pair programming?
Okay. So, for those who aren't familiar, pair programming is usually when two developers, I guess I'll use the simple version, two developers sit down side by side at the same computer looking at the same piece of code, and I guess there are a bunch of different ways to do it, but usually one person drives is the term often used, and the other person navigates. The driver is the person at the keyboard, and the navigator is the guy watching over his shoulder providing input as they go. And the notion is that it's an extreme programming technique, so that's from Kent Beck's XP Explained book, I believe it was called, back in '99. And the notion being that if code reviews are good, then why not code review all the time? So that's sort of what you get with pair programming to a degree, because the navigator can be doing some amount of that as you go, and the driver can be doing less of that, but can be doing some of that as you go. And the notion is that you take turns being driver and navigator. So what I usually do, what I've done more recently, is I've done a lot of remote pair programming because I used to live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and work with people, well, around the world, really. And so I was using various tools to share a terminal session over the internet. Sorry, cats are trying to destroy my desk.
They'll get you all the time, those cats.
Yeah. And we'd share a session, usually in the editor, and we're in the same shell, so in the same editor, looking at the same file and take turns. Although that's a whole stickier subject, because if one person's familiar with the toolchain you're using and the other's not, then one person implicitly ends up having to spend more time as the driver than the other.
Right, and that's one particular way of doing it, right? There's a bunch of different ones as well. Have you done any of the others?
How do you mean? You mean remote pairing?
So like in remote pairing, there's the like sometimes you'll have setups where somebody will have like video where you could see the other person.
Oh yeah,
which helps.
So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. No, I guess evolved my habits over the years. So what I got used to doing is I would have my terminal open. It would take up most of my screen, and it would be translucent. And I would have, like I have you right now, I have your video up here, so it's right below the camera. So when I'm looking at you, it looks like I'm looking at the camera. And I would have that image behind my terminal, which again was translucent, so that way I could get a little bit of the otherwise get lost when you're remote pairing. Because one thing it's a nuance, but when you're pairing in person, if there's one keyboard and one mouse, and I wanted to drive for just a moment, I might lean forward to grab the keyboard and the mouse. And that's physical nuances like that, signals like that can get lost if you don't have video. So yeah, I've done it with just audio. I've done it with video like that. And I interrupted as you were remarking on other approaches. So there's probably a lot of stuff I haven't tried.
No, that's fine. That's pretty awesome. I like that idea of having it in the background. I haven't done that. I've had it like on the side or on the bottom of the screen, but having it as the background makes a lot of sense because you're constantly looking at the person. One of the things I've heard from people is that, well, you don't feel connected because unless you set it up that way, the camera's not pointing directly at you. Sometimes it's like pointing to the side of your face. And so it's a little disconnecting rather than being right there with the person.
Right. Even then, with a translucent terminal, it's a hack. I mean, it works kind of, but to some degree, I think you just adapt to having that picture there, and you're not necessarily looking at it either.
So, Evan, in your experience, have you had productivity drops with pairing, or has it increased? What's been the productivity overall?
Well, let's see. From over the years, at first I think it goes down if you've never paired before, because it's a skill. There's going to be some amount of gear grinding as you're shifting gears essentially back and forth as you're taking turns driving and taking turns navigating. So there's certainly at least a short-term productivity loss, I think. I don't know that you actually write code any faster in my experience, but you end up with better code. And one of the experiences, I guess, that comes to mind for me most was probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was on a project where I was working with Pivotal Labs for a little bit, and we paired locally. And I'm trying to remember if I think we did remote pairing too. Then we were using RubyMine because that was what they like to use for their editor. That was one of those cases where they ended up doing a little more driving than I did, although it wasn't that hard to learn, but it was hard to be proficient in. Whereas these days I use Emacs, and when I've remote paired with people with Emacs, most of them don't know Emacs. They know VI or they know Sublime. And so there's that sort of give and take also. But no, working with the Pivotal Labs guys, I think that the software that we came up with was better than either one of the people, either me or my pair would have come up with individually. It's just that it probably took maybe the same amount of time, sometimes maybe even a little bit longer, but the quality was that much better.
Now, Pivotal Labs is a company that really buys into the pairing, so they're already sold, and that's great, and it works for them, and they have a system behind it. But there's a lot of companies out there that I've worked with and that haven't really bought into it. So you have to really sell them on it and what they get out of it, because there's no reason that they should actually incorporate a new system of working if they already have something that works. So how do you make pairing work for a company that hasn't bought into pairing, doesn't understand pairing, that considers it paying 2 people for the same job?
I think that they just have to try it, frankly. The argument that usually that I think has won in the past for me, although it's been a very long time since they've had to make it, is just that you will have less buggy code. And if you're measuring productivity in terms of just lines of code, you're probably doing it wrong, because lines of code aren't any indication of doneness. More code is not a good thing because code is a liability. But you want the least amount of code you need in order to achieve the goal you're trying to with the code that you're writing. So writing more code is not necessarily a good thing. Never mind that more code is likely to have more bugs statistically, I guess. So if you're going to say one person generates a consistent amount of bugs per lines of code, which I think is also a fallacy, but if we were to allow for that, then you would have more bugs. I contend if you're writing an awful lot of code in a short period of time, you're likely to have even more bugs proportionally than you would if you went slower. A lot of management folk who especially never dealt with pair programming maybe don't have a lot of experience with software projects. They just don't understand that. They're just thinking of sheer volume as some measure of productivity, and that's just not so.
So I think the companies that I'm referring to, they're new to web development in general and how we understand web development as developers for the web. So they don't have that context. And a lot of times they're starting out in software in general, and they don't buy into it because they're used to doing other types of businesses a certain way. So I think that's the big issue. And sometimes it's the attitude of, we've packaged software this way for the entire time, and we've been successful at doing this, so why should we change?
Well, when I freelanced for several years before I was at Rackspace, before I joined Octoro, and where I am now. And there were some projects where I had an apprentice, and I wanted to pair with the apprentice on the project, and I had to sell a client on allowing me to do that. First, it was a little bit easier because my apprentice's rate was lower than mine. But second, he was no schlock either. He was a pretty bright guy. And working together, we were able to produce better code. So I made that argument to the client. I said, look, it'll take maybe the same, maybe a little more time, but at the end, the product will be significantly better. And you want something that's solid. I'm a pretty good programmer. I will come up with something that's reasonably well thought out, but someone working with me is likely to catch mistakes as I make them, because I will make mistakes. We all do. And I mean, there are other benefits to pair programming too. They're not necessarily the kinds of concerns that a non-technical person, say like a client organization, would have, but they should be to some extent if for a long-running project. Programming is a great way to transfer knowledge. When you have one developer who's more experienced in a piece of code than another, then pair programming is a good way for the experienced person to transition that knowledge onto another developer. So one thing that I guess I've ended up talking about in almost every remotely significant software project I work on is the so-called bus factor. That is, how damaging would it be to the project if developer X was hit by a bus? Software developers are not interchangeable. Although the market would like it to be otherwise, to some extent we're treated that way as commodities, is somewhat fungible. But and while we don't want it to be commodities, we want to work well with the team, and working well with the team means being able to share knowledge. That is, that if I should be ill for a few days, or if I want to go on vacation, the team should be able to go on without me. So being able to transfer knowledge is important. And when you're not pairing, well, I have to brain dump all my ideas, all my knowledge into documentation, which
becomes very stale, right? Very quickly.
If you're doing it at the end, then yeah, it can certainly be stale. I mean, there are other people who talk about README-driven development or document-driven development. I think some GitHubbers they talk about that, and I think there's something to that. Although honestly, I haven't practiced that so much.
Yeah,
I tend to have to write documentation. It tends to come later.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the bus factor, because I was going to bring it up if you didn't. So one technique I got to work with a company that came in, a consulting company called ThoughtWorks, is an XP practice called the pairing staircase. And the pairing staircase really takes a team that, everyone will have their own, people that they pair with that they want to pair with often, or they want to, they have certain tendencies that they don't want to pair with a certain person. But what the staircase enables you to do is that each time you do a unit of work or you go through a sprint, you'll actually pair with someone different each time, someone up or down, depending on how you work it in the staircase. So you put the developers' names on this staircase type of graph, and then you go up and down as those units of work become available. So it was really exciting, and you get to eliminate that siloing of knowledge, because when you work with a large team and you're building a large application, and that large application keeps scaling, then it can be problematic that you're eventually going to be siloed into certain areas. Everyone will know, 5 people will know about this particular area, and 6 other people on the team may know about this one particular area, but nobody actually spreads that knowledge around. So it can be pretty problematic, and the pairing staircase can actually help you for those large type of projects especially.
I've heard it called promiscuous pairing in the past, which makes it sound like it's somehow dirty, but just promiscuous in terms of you're working with different people on a regular basis, and so sharing knowledge with different people on a regular basis, as a way to share techniques, but also as a way to share knowledge.
Yeah. So one thing that keeps coming up in conversations about pairing is, how do you measure success in pairing? And pairing is not an easy thing to measure. So companies they need these metrics to justify a certain practice because there's a bottom line for every company. So how do we handle this in companies? How do you measure success in pair programming?
I can't say that I have a good answer there. Really, the one thing I can think of is to be results oriented about it, and that's no, it doesn't work very well, right? You have to have a before and after.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have, before we start pairing and after we start pairing, and even after you start pairing. Immediately, if you just for the first time started pairing, your productivity is going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
But again, how do you measure that? You could try measuring it in terms of story point volume if you are using points, but I don't know that that's a good measure either, because individual contributors can bang out features faster probably than pairs, but less accurately. The only thing that makes sense to me is if you could measure churn on individual tickets or features or however you track units of work, and that's how often do tickets come back for rework versus before you started pairing. And I suppose it would have to be some combination of that versus your overall story point volume. Like how many story points, how many features are we banging out in a sprint if you're using sprints? We're talking in lowercase a agile here now. And then how often or how many story points worth, I guess, of features come back with bugs that have been created since you started pairing versus before you started pairing. But again, I think that would require a period of before pairing, collecting metrics like that, and then doing it after. And this is all just off the top of my head. I've yet to see anyone come up. I've yet to see quantitative metrics for pairing that help. But there are other aspects to pairing too, though, which management people who aren't familiar with pairing would probably appreciate. Software developers, if they thought about it, maybe they wouldn't like so much. And that's that pair programming is sort of a self-enforced form of micromanagement, because you and your pair keep yourself on task. Whereas when we work individually, unless you have laser focus, your mind's going to wander. You're not necessarily going to go look at Facebook or Reddit or what have you, but you might pause, go to the bathroom, take a drink, talk to a friend, look over your shoulder, and just start chatting. But when you're pairing, it tends to be pretty intense, that you're just going back and forth, bouncing ideas off of each other and generating work product. So there are fewer, at least in my experience when pairing, unless you have two relatively laid-back people pairing together, and even if you do, but I guess I'm not sure if I've had that experience or not. I think in general when you're pairing, even because I like to think I'm a little bit laid back. I mean, not anyway. When I'm pairing with someone else who might not be super intense, because I've paired with people who I think are very intense, and maybe people who think are more laid back. Even then, work tends to get done fairly quickly. Maybe there's a little more banter, but that seems fairly insignificant compared to the kinds of breaks that I would find myself maybe needing if I was working solo.
And I think the key to that too, though, is that it's not bad that you're taking breaks, right? It's bad that it's like, I'll take a break for X, I don't know how long it's going to take, versus if I'm pairing, all right, we got to get back to work, so let's break for 10 minutes, get some coffee, come back, get our minds fresh, and then we'll brainstorm, and then you're laser focused together because you're bouncing off ideas, like you said, which is, that's brilliant.
So what I was going to mention, I don't remember if I started doing this with Pivotal Labs or not. I mean, if they had introduced me to the Pomodoro Technique or where I picked up on it. But when I paired with them, they tended to work in 25-minute, half-hour increment, and they would take a 5 or 10-minute break and then rinse and repeat, which is very similar to the Pomodoro Technique, which is a technique for having a timer that you run for 25 minutes where you work focused, you don't let yourself get interrupted, then you allow yourself a 5-minute break. And then, I don't remember when this came out exactly, but the notion is that you have a timer that, you have a timer that you set for 25 minutes, you work in a focused way while the timer is running for those 25 minutes, and then when the timer goes off, you set the timer for 5 minutes, you take a short break, and you get up, you do anything not related to work, but that you have a hard stop. That timer goes off, you stop working.
Yeah.
And then you take it 5 minutes, the timer goes off again, and then you start up again. You start working, pick up where you left off. And you do that 3 times, and then you take a slightly longer break, and then you start over again. Take a 15-minute break is normal. Having that hard stop can be tough, especially when you're in the middle of your thinking. But I found that for me, on occasion, I need that to keep myself from working too hard. That I get caught deep in the weeds and focused on making something work that I don't want to come up for air until it does. And on the so-called maker schedule, that can be 4 hours. Sometimes creative work, it takes longer to get. For people who are doing creative work, it takes a while to get into flow, and then you don't produce anything for a significant period of time until you've been in flow for a while. So that's 2 other bits of jargon right there, right? Flow and the maker schedule. Occasionally I've used it when I feel like I'm a little too monomaniacal in my work and I'm not giving myself enough breaks and I feel myself getting tired, frustrated, stressed out. So I use it as a way to moderate myself, to keep myself from focusing too hard. To the detriment of being able to work, to the detriment of my endurance, I guess. So I guess I should write those down really fast.
I think it's great though. It's definitely a common problem with developers. I have the same issue where I'll be in the weeds and I'll be like, well, there's just this one error that I gotta fix. I'll take a look at this and I can just get this done, and then I'll be done in 10 minutes, and then 3 hours have gone by, and you're like,
right.
God, I should have just cut my losses and just stopped at that point and tried another path.
That's a Pomodoro technique can really help a lot, I found. That is that Pomodoro is enforced time boxing. That now there are a bunch of different apps for Pomodoro, and you don't need to use a physical timer, but there was one app I saw a while back, I don't have it anymore, unfortunately, where you enter the goal for your Pomodoro into the app before you start the timer. So each 25-minute segment has a specific goal that you're not necessarily going to accomplish in that time, but that's what you're working on. So occasionally, if I'm going to do something that I think is going to be a real nuisance, that might be really challenging, then I might put one Pomodoro to spike on it. That is that I'll give myself 25 minutes to play with it without writing any test, without trying to produce anything, but just give myself that time to learn. And that can be really useful because, as you just described, that what can happen is occasionally you get so caught up in trying to solve one thing that 3 hours goes by, you might finish it, but at the end of it you ask yourself, what did I really accomplish in all that time? Could I have done that smarter?
Yeah,
or could I have or maybe I should have just cut my losses.
That's where I find pairing is really useful too, where people will jump in and be like, wait, let's rethink this.
I guess when I've done talks about TDD in the past, sometimes I think I've compared it to some extent to pairing. That I think TDD and even the Pomodoro Technique both provide a similar benefit in that they allow for a certain cognitive shift, perceptual shift. That is that when I'm writing tests, I'm thinking one way. When I'm writing, doing TDD, I guess, or maybe BDD, depending on how you want to label it. There may be 3 different distinct steps to it, if you will. You're writing the description. You're describing the thing that you wanted to build. Then you're writing the code you wish you had and the tests that go with it. the test. Sorry, the AP. You're calling the API you wish you had in the test to exercise it, and then you're implementing it. The argument that I make is that you are in somewhat different frames of mind in each of those three modalities, and that to some extent is a little bit like, you could say, maybe pairing with yourself in a way. That first I'm thinking, what am I trying to accomplish? And then I'm thinking, okay, so what should it look like? But referring to what I'm trying to accomplish. Because the description you wrote, it's not there for other people. It's really there to help you think about what it is you're going to try to build. And then in English, which is cheaper than code. Then you try to write the test and the API that you want to test, that you are writing, and then you try to implement it. So you go from cheapest to less cheap to most expensive. Writing the code is the most expensive part. But those are different ways of looking at the problem. And anytime that there's any friction in that process where one doesn't line up with the other, so maybe as I'm writing my test, or maybe as I'm describing that API, that imaginary API, I might realize, this doesn't quite line up with the description I just wrote. Which one is wrong? Because probably one of them is wrong. And then the same thing with the implementation. And sometimes when I get down in the implementation, I start writing implementation, I realize, oh wait, this is deviating a little from the test, or it's deviating from that description. Which one's wrong?
Yeah, or it's not testing what it's supposed to test, what it's really supposed to be.
Right, exactly. And the Pomodoro Technique, sort of similarly with the enforced breaks, that you're getting deep in the weeds, and then you have to step back and not do the work during that break. And at least for me, when I'm not working, my mind invariably ends up going to the work, but then I'm not thinking about it quite the same way because I'm hands off, which, I don't know, I guess that's it's something that developers don't necessarily talk about a lot, but I think I've heard some people mention that I think we all understand that most of our work is not typing. Most of our work is thinking, and the typing should be happening far less often. So, but occasionally I think we get into this mode where we are just banging things out, that there's a lot to do. When you get into that mode, it's easy to turn the brain off because we try to achieve flow, which is where we're in our element, we're doing what we think we need to do. That is, I guess the mission is clear, big decisions have been made, and then we're just doing mechanics and just banging features out. But the trouble is when we get there, we're not being self-critical, and so we might be making very big picture mistakes.
Yeah, I think I've seen that quite a bit with particular features, that there's pressure to get out. Like you're in a sprint and it's near the end of the sprint and people are just like plowing through, like you're saying, where they're just typing everything, and you do that too because you're like, well, this will work, this might work, and you're testing different things. But if we actually stopped, thought about the problem, tried it, went back, it's easy to say, right? But in implementation with doing this, there's a lot of pressure outside of the development.
And that's one of the reasons that I use TDD, because when I don't TDD, I feel myself losing my rigor. Sometimes I guess I've heard it called acceptance test-driven development, or outside-in test-driven development. I think this might be more almost what the BDDers really consider to be BDD, especially people who like Cucumber an awful lot. That's not me, but I won't go into that. That's a whole different topic. But that is that start with the user-facing perspective of whatever it is you're working on. And user doesn't necessarily mean the guy pushing the button, because it can be an API call too, depending what you're working on. Like maybe you're working on a web service, not an actual web app. Then do the TDD process starting from there. So as a user, the user is trying to, or you have the feature, which might be something like a user buys a something or other. And so the user navigates through the system, chooses a product they want to buy, adds it to a shopping cart, and then they go check out, and then after they check out, an order is generated and the customer is billed. And that's maybe deeper into the weeds than I want to be. It really be, what does the user experience as part of that process? So when the user goes through the website, what do they see? What important things do they see? What important interactions do they have? and that underneath the hood the web app is creating an order, and that underneath the hood the web app is charging the customer, are things that come out later. So if you start with the user perspective, you're going to end up with a lot of tests that'll fail because you're going to say, the user does this, so the user clicks on this link and they go to this page. Well, unless that page exists already, well, that's great. That says go rate the next test. And then when you get to a checkout process, well, when the user successfully checks out, they might get you want them to see a page where they successfully checked out. Well, what does successfully checking out mean? And then you start peeling that onion, where you end up writing lower level tests. If you start at the top with what does the user see, and then start unraveling from that what has to go on in the system for the user to see these things, for the user to have these interactions with the system, then in my experience, you mostly write only the code you need in order to perform the task at hand.
I think that a lot that way, the outside in. But I've met lots of developers who don't like working that way, and they'll start from that metal level, that base level, where they'll be working with the system and the architecture, making sure all that's set for the requirements that are given by business. So it's interesting. You brought up a great point when you said everyone is looking at this from the outside in. Have you ever paired with a designer at all?
A little bit.
It's a different outcome that you're sort of looking for, but it's an interesting way to use the power of pairing.
I'm used to, I guess, having wireframes provided to me, and I guess wireframes, I think, is the right term. Something fairly rough that indicates the flow between pages, and which components would be involved in that. Not necessarily having the actual assets in hand, but then having some back and forth discussion with the designer over that, and then going in to write code. I'm not sure what it would be like. It might be interesting, but I'm not sure what it would be like to sit down and pair with a designer on that.
I kind of think of it like a workshop, right? Where you do these workshops to figure out what the feature is going to be, what are the requirements. So typically with that, you'll have a data person, you'll have an architecture person, you'll have the product, somebody in there from all different parts of your product or service that you're providing. So this way you can get all those perspectives. So if you do this with a designer,
it doesn't sound like a pairing session.
Yeah,
it doesn't sound like a pairing session so much as you said, almost, well, not necessarily review board, but when you have that many people, it'd be awfully hard to be productive. I think that larger a team is, the more complex the communication gets.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not how it's described in Lean UX for sure. It's my thinking that I agree with you. At the early stages is where that's important, to define the user flow.
Yeah.
And get the basic functionality down. Because a lot of times a designer will not understand that, hey, this functionality will not really happen the way that you want it to happen, and vice versa. Well, this particular design will not work the way that you developer think it will.
And yes, and that, I've seen, I guess one project I had about 5 years ago, the designer was asking for some pretty cutting-edge stuff for what you could do with JavaScript and CSS at the time, and we had some concerns about limitations of the various popular browsers out there, but just the sheer complexity of it too. I don't really remember. I think we actually went with an awful lot of that complex stuff because it's what the customer wanted. It just made for some tricky code. But one thing I wanted to circle back on is that where Cucumber, my understanding, Cucumber is supposed to be a communication tool. But in my experience, Cucumber's been around for, I guess, about 6 years now, and I feel like it's changed. It's the people who've been working on it and pitching it. The message has changed that they've been sending over the years. That it didn't seem like it started so much as a communication tool, but as a communication tool that facilitate testing specifically, and that they had different techniques that were built into the tool that they've since backed out of. That there were web steps before that Cucumber was closer to the browser, and I think the best practice with Cucumber is to write your tests a bit more abstract, or write the descriptions a bit more abstractly. I guess I've been away from Cucumber for too long. My sense has been that the message behind it has changed, but it's supposed to be about communication. And I believe you can achieve that communication with simpler tooling. I mean, RSpec has the ability to print out specs, or the spec descriptions in a nested format. It's just plain English. Back in the day, because I didn't like Cucumber, I wrote a tool, I guess this was like 5 years ago, called coulda, which was a combination of, in my mind, it was of Cucumber met shoulda. It was just trying to provide given when then, but with the minimal amount of overhead, and then have it be easily serializable to English. Because for me, what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to write my specs out in code, or in something close to code. I wanted to be able to have my be able to write them in test unit at the time, and then not necessarily write the test right away, but I wanted to be able to easily just marshal it to English, which just meant take the test, dump it to something that looks like Gherkin, which is Cucumber's format, and then show it to a customer and say, hey, what do you think of this? And then get some feedback on that. And then periodically just be able to do that. Because I found it, in my experience with Cucumber, I found it awkward to have non-technical people or less technical people than developers or maybe QA. QA can, I mean, I've seen QA use Cucumber to some effect, and I've heard a few good stories about that. I've had issues with people who are less technical than development or QA trying to write Gherkin, again, Cucumber DSL, because when you're writing in Cucumber's fake English Gherkin, you're programming via regex.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily know that when you're the person writing it. And my experience is just don't have these people programmed. Just have a medium that you can communicate in, which can be just plain English. Write your specs in such a way that you can serialize them to English, and not, when I say English, I don't mean developer ease. I mean not speaking at the machine level, but have some tests that are at a high enough level that business people can understand them, and use that as your point of contact. It doesn't have to be Cucumber. It can be any old tooling where you can write some strings in the code, and those can come out as text later. And RSpec again has that feature built in. So I don't see a compelling need for Cucumber.
Abdi Grimm, he talks a lot about pairing. I love a lot of the ideas that he has with this, where with the testing involved specifically, one thing that stuck out to me was, he said if you're designing, you're creating like something new. So the design part of this, the creation of it, then using TDD in general is a good idea, because that'll help structure how you create things. So do you think that works better with pairing? And maybe I'm misquoting him, but that's the general takeaway.
Well, I got half of what you said. You got a little bit cut off, but I heard you mention Abdi, or I'm inferring Abdi because you mentioned wide teams and Ruby rogues. So, and I know Abdi. I think that TDD and pairing are compatible. I think to some extent they're self-reinforcing. I mean, mutually reinforcing. I think I've heard some people suggest if you're pairing, you don't need TDD. TDD is, pairing is to some extent a thought tool. To some extent, self-imposed micromanagement. But TDD, you can see TDD as sort of a different kind of self-imposed micromanagement. But it's also, let's not forget, it's test-driven design is how a lot of people call it, not test-driven development.
Right. And
this cat really wants to climb on me right now. So TDD, I think, will help you suss out weaknesses in your software design that you wouldn't necessarily notice individually, or maybe or that your pair wouldn't necessarily notice. Is that you're writing the API you wish you had, and then you're immediately trying to consume it. And that, to me, is usually the best test of an API is how easily is it consumed, how obvious is it, and the obviousness, of course, is subjective, and that's where pairing, I think, is good too. That is that I think a good API, I hesitate to say, doesn't necessarily need documentation, but is documenting just reads very naturally. And when I say reads naturally, to me, working in Ruby, it reads a bit like English. Not necessarily to the extent that RSpec tries to, but I think that you get pretty close to that with Ruby. And I think having a pair with you to provide that critique, that's where pairing is. If code review is good, then pairing is more code review.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think that plus TDD makes for better software design, period. Because they both contribute to higher quality code.
And I think my experience with code reviews has been you lose the context to really judge it well, too. Like, we've used tools like at places. I've used tools at places like Jarrett, and I didn't really have a good experience because it's very disconnecting. You have to wait on, between these. Like, if you have two people who have to approve it, they've got to fit it into their schedule to approve it, and it sort of takes away from the whole purpose of the testing, in my opinion.
I don't know. You say that you lose context. At the same time, I think there's value in not having that context, because if I'm reviewing a piece of code and I've never seen it before,
Mm-hmm.
if I can't understand what's going on, that says something about the code.
That's true. That is a good point.
Unless I assume that I'm
too much into it, there's a lot of edge cases you would miss, for sure. I can agree with that. And the TDD, too, a lot of people think, oh, well, I have to be very structured. I have to do it this way, and they get lost in the details of it. And I think what people don't get is the important thing is we're testing, right? We're not just arbitrarily shooting from the hip, cowboy style, and throwing code out there. We're actually making sure it works consistently. And that doesn't mean you have to use the same tools that everyone else is using. You could do like code reviews or spot checking, or even have a QA come over and pair with you.
I guess in the past year or two, I've begun to think more of, partly because Noel Rappin has beat me over the head just a little bit about it, about the difference between the tests I write as part of TDD and then tests I write for verification purposes. And that they're not necessarily the same thing. That when you're TDDing, so I guess maybe this deviates a bit from Kent Beck's definition of TDD from back in test-driven development by example. I think the way Noel has framed it, and we've chatted about this a little bit, that there are those two different kinds of tests. There are tests that help you think about the problem, that help you design the code, and then there are the tests that prove that it works correctly. So, like boundary testing, for example, on your inputs is not necessarily a TDD exercise. That's more of a verification test of, does it work correctly given these inputs? Does it work correctly when I'm at the extreme end of what's legal, when I'm at the boundary, or when I exceed it? It's going to change your implementation, but that's really a TDD concern. And I think that this is where I don't have experience, is when you want to maybe delete tests later. Because for any mature software project, you could delete the TDD tests after the fact, as long as you have verification tests to prove that things work. Once you're done thinking it through, maybe you don't need them anymore.
A lot of companies, even large companies, they don't, corporate level doesn't, buy into the whole QA thing, right? So it falls on the developers to do all of the testing. And so in this case that you're talking about, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, that QA would be a great asset to have to kind of piece all that together with you.
I think it depends, because I've had experience with organizations with and without QA. I think as projects get big, then maybe you need QA, but then, and this is where I have less experience, and I'm starting to experience this more, frankly, with Optoro, is we're taking a big project, we're trying to break it into smaller pieces. Yeah. As you get down to the smaller pieces, I don't know that you need QA on the small pieces. Now, there's a talk by, I guess I'll mention it here, by J.B. Rainsberger. Oops, wow, I'm trying to indent things. That's called Integration Tests Are a Scam. And it's rather lengthy, it's sort of ad hoc the way he delivered it. He meanders a bit, but he makes some really interesting points. And ultimately what he's saying is, it sounds like to me he's essentially saying you don't need QA if you do just such a way. It's just that most people don't do unit testing in just the way he describes. And the short version is what he promotes is contract-based testing using stubs and mocks on one hand, and then on the other side of it, wherever you're using a stub or a mock, that you have a test against the actual entity that proves that stub or mock is valid. Because otherwise you have that problem where you risk talking to a stub or a mock that is simulating behavior that doesn't actually work or actually behaves completely differently than the stub or mock expects it to. But if you do that religiously, then he argues you don't need integration/acceptance tests.
Yeah, and the lines between all of those are very, very fuzzy from place to place, I've found.
Well, an acceptance test usually is framed as something where the user simulating users clicking on things, or maybe simulating API calls. Integration tests, I guess integration test is maybe, and integration test and unit test are maybe the really hard ones, right?
Yeah.
Because some people do say, anytime if you're touching a database, you're doing an integration test.
Or even another class, right?
Sorry. Well, and some people will even say that too. Some people will say that a unit, if you're doing object-oriented programming, then anytime that you're talking to another class, some people will say that that's also an integration test. And then that's also you could contend it's a matter of what you define as a unit. Where is your unit? What's the boundary of the system you're trying to test?
Right.
But I guess if you end up in that sort of nuanced discussion, then everything could be then everything's a unit test or it's an acceptance test at that point. That seems, I don't know, silly maybe.
And it could be philosophically argued either way.
Yeah. It's just nomenclature is helpful, so I tend to like unit test as you're testing a class. That's it. And that's what I think what JB was talking about there, that you have a series of unit tests where one leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, and as long as you test all those contract boundaries on both sides, then you don't need integration/acceptance tests.
Yeah.
But that video is online, so far be it for me to try to go into that further. Just go watch JB.
I don't think we can actually not talk about testing and pair programming together because they do tend to go together, like you said.
Yeah.
But I do want to jump back. We've talked a lot about the benefits of pair programming. Mm-hmm. Are there any that we missed?
Well, yeah. There's maybe one of the most basic ones, because we're talking about mechanics really, but we haven't talked about the human aspect. Mm-hmm. For example, one of the reasons I work at Optoro now as opposed to Rackspace is I live in a suburb of DC, and all the people I was working with at Rackspace were, especially my team, were in different parts of the country, even different parts of the world. Rackspace is based in San Antonio. So the closest I could get to someone was traveling to them every couple months or so and going to or meeting people at conferences, or maybe remote pairing or having a chat over video. Video chat's nice and all, but we're animals too. I mean, and I don't mean that in any sort of denigrating way. I mean that there's a distinctly human component to being in a room and sitting with other people, or being someplace physically with other people. And so I just grew to feel isolated. I've been working remotely for the better part of 6 years, actually maybe more like 7, and it's kind of a complicated story. Just within the past several months, I realized that I just can't work in isolation anymore. It feels too isolating. So with pairing allows us, or gives us an excuse not to be isolated thought workers. I think a lot of what goes into thought work is inherently isolating, that we spend so much time thinking that we're living out whole worlds up here and in our code, but we're not communicating much with our colleague. That you might chat over a chat room. Occasionally you might get up and talk to a coworker if you're in an office. That's if you're in an office. But otherwise, if you're not pairing, you're often heads down trying to solve hard problems. And in a lot of ways, it's not all that different than working at home or working in an office completely by yourself. And for a lot of people, that can be kind of depressing. So pairing, I found, is a social lubricant, or I guess maybe a workplace lubricant that way. it allows us to feel more connected at a human level. Unless there is just inherently good communication in an organization, then we all tend to end up in silos.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty rare that you get, perfect communication across the board, right? There's always, I found every place I've worked at has had some communication breakdown somewhere, and it is not a bad thing per se. It's just a reality. That's the way it is in a lot of places, at least the ones I've been at.
People focus so much on the doing that they don't focus so much on the sharing.
Yeah.
So it's just a common problem not to know, well, what are my colleagues doing? Well, unless you have a regularly scheduled demo time, for example, which is something we do at Octoro weekly on Fridays. We get together and we have a few minutes to show off what it was we were doing, and it's sort of a good-naturedly show off a little bit, and then we vote on who did the most interesting thing that week. There's a little prize at the end of it if you win enough times, but it's not a hugely significant thing. So it's not terribly competitive. It's more of just an excuse to get together and socialize and share. So while where I am, we don't pair very much, there is at least some mechanism to try to compensate for that somewhat.
That's pretty awesome, actually. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's... I'm still getting a sense for it. I like it. I think it's a lot better than not having that sort of sharing things. Instead, you just have a staff meeting where it's more hierarchical. Well, this person's doing that, this person's doing that, or maybe even worse, and I've seen this before in a number of organizations, you have large teams, 20-plus people teams, who are doing a lot of vaguely related things, but not directly related, and they have what they call a stand-up, right, where you talk about, here's what I did today, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I'm doing today, here's what I'm stuck on. And for a large organization, most of what those people will say won't make any sense. And I've seen a few different large organizations do this, and it just doesn't seem to work very well.
Yeah.
The stand-ups are for small teams, so something like this I think is better for sharing with larger teams that people can actually see what it is you're working on, because you do a mini presentation on it, basically. You do a show and tell every week.
What are the costs and the bad things about pair programming that you found, or the misconceptions even?
Cost. Well, there's certainly cost in terms of the amount of time it takes to learn to become at all proficient in pair programming. There's potential cost to relationships too in the office, that there are some people you're probably just not going to pair well with because you just work very differently, and that can be extremely frustrating.
It can be valuable too, though, at times. But frustrating.
Sure, it can work both ways, but I have found that there are some people I just pair very, very, very badly with, and it's just very frustrating, and it's hard to learn much from. As a general rule, I mean, I seem to pair I tend to pair at least pretty well with people. I find most people tend to be pretty easy to get along with, and even some people who I like, I don't necessarily pair well with. Again, it's just different working styles. So there's a little potential cost in terms of maybe some small amount, some friction in relationships. I mean, that's anytime you have human interaction. Maybe your goal really is to just bang out as much code as you can, and you don't care that much that everything works particularly well. An example would be like an early stage startup. In that case, your cost is sheer volume. That maybe you want more features, even if they are kind of buggy, because if you don't reach your deadline for raising your next round, because maybe you have to have certain features in order to convince investors to raise that next round, and if you can't get at least something partially functional out, then you're doomed. If instead you're focusing on trying to get something super high quality out, but you won't make your schedule, well, you failed, right? If you have that deadline. So sometimes pair programming can get in the way of deadlines. It's just a matter of what's your tolerance for bugs in the code, frankly. If your tolerance is relatively high, then pairing might not be the best answer because that cost could be too high.
Can you pay now or can you pay later, right?
That's right. It's usually easier, I guess a rule of thumb is it's easier to fix the bug before you've even written the code, or when you're writing the code, it's much harder to fix it after you've written, especially after you deployed it. So yeah, pay now or pay later. Sometimes it's worth racking up debt when you get right down to it. Sometimes it's worth sometimes debt is leverage. I don't think that's usually the case, but it can be.
Have you been at any companies that didn't pair before you got there, and they managed to make it part of their culture and have it stick?
It's to have it stick part, right? So I've had some organizations that I've consulted with where I've gotten them to pair. I don't know whether it stuck well past when I left. Yeah, that's always the thing with consulting when you're out, or you check it. I often wouldn't check in to see how they were doing after. Sometimes I would. So maybe I should have done that more. I think some of them continue to pair, but there are some kinds of work that I don't believe lend themselves well to pairing. So making simple changes to markup, changing copy, some light style sheet changes, for example. I guess you could argue that there are some code changes that...
Depending on complexity.
Really depends on complexity. But also, whether that's worth it or not, I believe also would depend on how quality focused you are about that particular thing. Because copy could be a very big deal, depending what kind of organization you are, or depending what part of your application it is. It depends.
Yeah, I've had it where bugs were sort of like something that you wouldn't do, but then to me it's like, well, what's the scope of the bug?
Right,
because
and
you could work on a bug for like 5 days, or you could work on it for 5 minutes.
And in pairing on bugs, I found that pairing on bugs actually makes it go faster. It's just it's the classic example. If you think about when you're writing your own code and you have a typo, and it causes a test to break or causes the code not to interpret. Sometimes you can spend, or I have spent, sometimes I've spent way more time than I'm proud to admit trying to resolve such a thing. And sometimes it's little things like that where a pair can make all the difference in the world, where they'll see it, in just seconds, which would otherwise take me minutes sometimes on occasion, and that adds up. Yeah. So no, I found pairing on bugs can be a significant speed increase. But even that's what I described. It's not necessarily a bug case. That could just be you're writing new software and you just made a stupid mistake. And I've had pairs help me significantly there too.
It's interesting because sometimes there'll be some giant stack trace or something, and you look at the problem and you're taking, so much time to do this on your own. But when you have a pairing partner, then suddenly that other person has this outside context that they can point out and be like, whoa, wait, check this out. It's just this one little piece that broke the whole compilation or broke the build. Let's fix this. And so it's great to get that second pair of eyes on that.
Yep, it can save you boatloads of time if you have a pair to point that out to you, that is.
When I first heard of pair programming, I had a very negative attitude where I was thinking, this is crazy. Why would I even do this? And once you actually start doing it, you realize that it's very beneficial. And at least for me, it improved my workflow quite a bit. The interaction with people, whether it's remote or together, really worked out for me.
So one place I found it to be, I found that it doesn't necessarily work very well, is when you have a large skill gap between the two people pairing. And skill, I'm not sure, is really the right term there. I think maybe it might be more a matter of a large experience gap, where you have someone who's been working for, coding for 15 or 20 years, me, for example, pairing with someone who is brand new to programming, or very, very, very new. On in a constrained environment, like say at a code retreat, working on Conway's Game of Life, that can kind of work. I think then that the more junior developer spends most of their time learning and occasionally asking questions. It sometimes makes the more experienced developer see things a little bit differently, perhaps. The experienced developer can still learn some, but maybe not as much. But when you're closer in experience, in terms of just amount of experience, different experience, I think, is actually very useful a lot of the time. But when you're close to, when you have a similar amount of experience and some overlapping experience, that's, I think, where I've had a lot of the best pairing, most effective pairing.
Well, yeah, I've definitely experienced it where it's, you learn from the different viewpoints, but I can see that. Uh, yeah, I can see that it could slow things down, but it also depends on what your purpose is for pairing. Are
Right.
you working on a feature, a bug, or are you doing this to get someone up to speed on code?
Right.
That would be a good use case for that, I think.
So when working with someone who has a lot less experience, what I found to some degree can work um, is to intentionally limit the scope of what it is you're working on.
Yeah.
Uh, when I was doing some remote pairing consulting, some of the hardest times I had was when I was working with someone who was fairly new, who had some extremely ambitious goal, some lofty goal for an application they wanted to build. And so it would be difficult sometimes to focus on one part of the application. And because they had so much to learn, it would essentially turn into me just building it with them watching, even though I was trying to explain and trying to teach as we'd go. I don't feel that that's a good way to learn, because if you're not getting your hands dirty working on the code, then at least in my experience, then you don't learn nearly as much. If you're just
Yeah.
watching someone else bang things out and code appears on screen, that's not a particularly good form of learning, I don't believe.
Well, that also lends to the technique too. If you do like the ping pong where you're going back and forth,
Right.
that might work better for that particular case.
I think it can. It's just that when the when the goal of the activity is to build something that the less experienced person simply does not know how to do at all.
Yeah.
When it's a brand new skill for them.
So let's take a second to talk about tools of the trade. What are the services or tools for remote pair programming or pair programming in general that you typically use or you would recommend to listeners?
I have not used a lot of the pair programming services. I'm aware of them. There's Nitrous.io. There's Screen Hero. I haven't tried either. I've heard some people say that Nitrous is great. I've heard anecdotes. I've heard people say good things about Nitrous. I've heard some people say that Screen Hero is a bit of a bandwidth hog, but I know that you can attenuate bandwidth usage for Screen Hero. I ended up using was a combination of Vagrant and Tmux. So more recently I heard of something called Teammate, which is Tmux that was specifically designed for programming. At least that's how I've heard people describe it. So I guess I ought to mention that here in the notes. I have yet to use Teammate though. I used Tmux and Vagrant. I used to create a cloud server, just a server running it in Rackspace, and in the Vagrant file, I had it download my Emacs, my .emacs.d, set up basic things like Git and Ruby, and then I would just log in and git clone the repo we were going to work on. Well, add databases as necessary, though I think I wasn't working on any Rails apps at the time. The only mild nuisance was manually adding the my pairs SSH key. I think different Vagrant plugins allow for that differently or facilitate that by degrees. But it was relatively simple. You could get a server running inside of maybe 2-3 minutes. I think this is something that, to get a little deeper in the weeds, something that Docker could help with a bit, because there was a lot of time spent in Vagrant after the server came up provisioning the server. Docker would allow conceivably to have an image that is already mostly provisioned. So if you're working with a cloud host that lets you provide a Docker image to Vagrant, I am completely uncertain if any of these, if that's out there yet. I think it might. Then that could allow you to have a very fast provision development environment. The reason I like this, though, a configuration like that, though, is that you can have your AV is completely separate, your audio video chat is completely separate from your session, and it gives you fairly fine degree of control over bandwidth usage. So SSH, for example, does not use much bandwidth at all. You're not screen sharing, so you're not using much bandwidth. You can turn off the video, just like we did, to use less bandwidth. Get rid of AV chat entirely and communicate via phone at a lower quality of voice, but not using any bandwidth at all, conceivably. So I would like that approach because it gave me more control. Nitrous, I think the appeal is that you can click a button and have a development environment in short order, and there's just very little for you to do. Screen Hero, I think, is somewhat similar in that it's just lets you share your screen and have two-way interaction. So with Screen Hero, you're actually able to manipulate the mouse pointer, I think, and click in the other person's environment if they so allow. And it's funny, I'm completely blanking, but there is a technology that's been around for ages that I used to use for that for a bit, and it was very clunky and a bit of a bandwidth hog. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
I used Screen Hero when it was like in beta or alpha.
Yeah.
I liked it. It was pretty good. It was buggy. It crashed here and there. So I was kind of excited they kind of went into their first version, and then now they're charging for it. So I was like, oh, that's...
Yeah, I figured that was inevitable.
So, but I did like the product. It was a good product. So the Docker idea is really appealing to me. I only just started using Vagrant recently, and we're using it at my current job, and it's been working out fantastic. So I definitely want to check out the Docker piece of that. But it does take a lot of time to load it initially.
Because you're still Vagrant will create the server for you, but then you're also provisioning the server through your Vagrant file, and that provisioning, installing Ruby, installing Git, and apt getting all the things takes time. For my limited playing with Docker, that's someplace where Docker could potentially speed things up an awful lot.
So now that I'm using more VMs in my workflow, I'm quickly learning that space on a hard drive actually matters. So I'm having to do lots of backups, and always when I'm doing Vagrant, there's a command to tear down everything and get rid of the VM called Vagrant Destroy, which is, every time you do a new project and you're done with it, let's say you're done and you may want to come back to it later, but you're done for right now, Vagrant Destroy, it gets rid of all those files, and it's really, really fast and really useful. Initially a little setup to get the VM to where you want it and all the install instructions for scripts, but really fantastic tool.
Oh yeah, well, especially on your own machine if you're using why can't VirtualBox or whatever I guess client you're using for Vagrant. Because I think maybe Vagrant works with things other than VirtualBox, but I've only used VirtualBox.
Yeah, that's all I've used with it as well. So I really appreciate you coming on, Evan. It's been a great conversation. I love talking about this stuff, so it's pretty cool.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
If people want to find you or learn more about pair programming or TDD, or just learn more about what you're doing at at your new workplace, how can they find you? I'm
on Twitter way too often, although Twitter's getting slightly scarier.
And Evan is eLight, so at eLight on Twitter. So check him out on Twitter.
I still have my tripledogdare.net website. As I said, I used to do freelancing. I have not been, but occasionally I entertain side jobs. I keep that out there because who knows, maybe someday I'll want to go back to freelancing. I don't know. That's usually a link to lots of things about me too. I've got my blog that I don't update very often anymore. That's pretty much it.
Well, thanks again, Evan.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3 Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.